The old soldier's hand was shaking before I even asked my first question. I had traveled 4 systems to sit across from Vexthal Corrin, the last living commander of the Ashfall campaign, and within 10 seconds of turning on my recorder, I understood why nobody else had managed to get him to talk. His eyes were fixed on the wall behind me, as if something were still standing there, waiting. "You want to know about the humans," he said. It was not a question. I told him yes. I told him that my people had never met a human, that we only knew them through trade reports and cautious diplomatic notices, and that the official compact records of the war were sealed. I told him I wanted the truth, not the version written by committees who were never there. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The truth," he repeated. "Nobody has asked me for the truth in 30 years. They ask me for a summary. They ask me for a lesson. Nobody asks for the truth, because the truth doesn't fit in a briefing folder." He poured himself a drink from a bottle that had clearly been opened many times before, and for a moment I thought he might simply ask me to leave. Instead, he set the glass down without drinking from it and looked at me directly for the first time. "Do you know why we stopped calling it a war?" he asked, "and started calling it a mistake?" I shook my head. "Because a war implies 2 sides who understand what they are fighting for. We understood. They never did. Not the way we expected them to, and that difference is the only reason I am alive to sit here and annoy you with old man stories." He leaned back, and the light in the room seemed to dim, though nothing had changed. It was simply the weight of what he was about to say. "It starts with a distress signal," he said, "one we never should have answered. 31 years ago, Vexthal was a young officer aboard a compact survey cruiser called the Long Horizon, patrolling the outer trade lanes on a routine mapping mission. Their sensors picked up a faint signal from a system that had never been catalogued, a weak repeating pulse broadcasting on an old, almost primitive frequency. It was not a threat. It was not even a proper greeting. It was simply a signal sent out into the dark by a species that had no idea anyone was listening. Compact protocol was clear. Any signal from an uncontacted world triggered an automatic response fleet, sent not to conquer, but to observe, to catalog, and if the species was deemed suitable, to offer what the compact called guided integration. It was a polite term for a process that had worked, without serious incident, on 11 other species before that day. Vexthal remembered the briefing well. The species was called human. They lived on a single world, technologically primitive by compact standards, still burning fuel extracted from their own ground, still fighting occasional conflicts among themselves over borders and beliefs. The analysts on the Long Horizon found this almost charming. One officer joked that the humans were still learning to share a planet, and everyone laughed, because nobody in that room believed a species without interstellar travel could ever be a threat to anyone. "We were not afraid of them," Vexthal told me. "That is the first thing you need to understand. Nobody was afraid. We were curious. We were, if anything, a little condescending. We had integrated species with 3 hearts, species who could survive in vacuum, species who communicated through color instead of sound. A soft, single-hearted mammal with poor eyesight and no shell did not concern us at all. The first contact fleet arrived in human space 6 months later, commanded by an official named Director Sel Aranis, a career diplomat with an excellent record of peaceful integration. Vexthal was part of the Honor Escort, a small formation of ships meant to project strength without appearing hostile. Their orders were simple: establish communication, explain the benefits of compact membership, begin the slow, careful process of bringing humanity into the wider galactic community. For the first several days, everything went exactly as planned. Human governments were startled, understandably so, but not hostile. They sent representatives. They asked questions. They were, according to the reports Vexthal read at the time, remarkably composed for a species facing their first proof that they are not alone in the universe. There were meetings. There were translated speeches. There was even, on the third day, something the humans called a welcoming dinner, where representatives from a dozen human nations sat across the table from compact diplomats and shared food that Vexthal still remembered as strange but not unpleasant. For a while, he said, I believed this would be the easiest integration in compact history. I remember writing that in a private letter to my sister. I remember being wrong within the week. The trouble began, as it so often does, with a boundary. Compact survey teams identified a region of human territory that their instruments flagged as strategically valuable, a stretch of coastline rich in resources the compact wanted for shipbuilding. Standard procedure called for a formal request to the local governing body, followed by a fair negotiation for use of the land. Director Uranus, confident in the goodwill built over the previous days, authorized the request to be delivered directly, along with an offer of advanced technology in exchange. The humans said no, not out of hostility, at first. It was simply that the land in question held meaning beyond its resources. Homes were there, history was there, something the local translators struggled to properly convey, a kind of attachment to place that ran deeper than the compact's models accounted for. Uranus, still operating under the assumption that humans would eventually accept the obvious benefits of cooperation, ordered a survey team to begin preliminary work anyway, believing that demonstrating the technology in practice would change minds faster than further negotiation. It was meant to be a peaceful gesture. Vexthal remembered the mood on the ship that morning, calm, even optimistic. Nobody expected what happened next. A small group of humans, armed with equipment that compact analysts had rated as barely capable of harming even themselves, approached the survey site and ordered the team to leave. When the survey team did not comply, believing themselves to be under no real threat, the humans made it clear, through actions rather than words, that they were not asking twice. That was the moment, Vexthal said quietly. That was the exact moment everything the compact believed about this species began to fall apart. We expected fear, we expected negotiation, or at worst, symbolic protest. What we got instead was resolve, immediate, total, unshakable resolve, from people who by every measurement we had should have simply given up. The survey team retreated without serious incident, and for a day, compact leadership treated it as a minor misunderstanding, an overreaction born of cultural difference. Vexthal remembered the mood shifting again, this time toward reassurance. Diplomatic teams were sent to smooth things over. Translators worked overtime to clarify intentions. Everyone still believed this could be resolved with enough patience and enough goodwill. Then came the message that changed everything. A short, simple transmission from the human government overseeing that coastline, translated and delivered to the compact fleet, with no diplomatic softening at all. "This is our home," the message read. "We did not ask you to come here. We will not be moved." Vexthal told me that when that message reached the bridge of the long horizon, several officers actually laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of genuine surprise. It seemed, to them, like the statement of a child refusing to share a toy, not the declaration of a species preparing to fight a war they had no reasonable chance of winning. "We did not understand yet," he said. "We thought their refusal was born of ignorance, that they simply did not grasp how outmatched they were. It never occurred to us that they understood perfectly well, and had decided it did not matter." Director Uranus, still hoping to avoid conflict, ordered a demonstration. Not an attack, he was careful to specify, simply a display of compact capability, meant to encourage a more realistic negotiation. A small formation of ships, including the one Vexthal served on, was sent to hold position near the disputed coastline, a show of presence rather than force. It was supposed to end the disagreement without a single shot fired. Instead, it became the spark that lit the fire. "I still remember the sound," Vexthal said, and for the first time since our conversation began, his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. Not an explosion, not an alarm, just a voice, over the comm channel, human, calm, almost polite, informing us that we were not welcome in their skies, and I remember thinking, this is nothing. This is a species with no starships, no shields, nothing that should be able to touch us. He looked at me then, and something in his expression made the hair on the back of my neck rise, even though I had never felt fear from a compact veteran before. I was wrong, he said, about almost everything. And what happened next is something I have never been able to explain to anyone who was not there to see it happen with their own eyes. He reached for his glass again, and this time he drank from it, slowly, as if steadying himself for what came next. That was the day, he said, the war truly began. Not because we declared it, not because they declared it. It began the moment we realized, far too late, that we had mistaken patience for weakness, and quiet for surrender. He set the glass down, and the silence in the room stretched long enough that I almost spoke just to fill it. Then he looked past me again, toward that same spot on the wall, and continued, "If you want to understand what happened to the compact fleet in the months that followed," he said, "you first have to understand something we did not know yet. Something no species we had ever met before had prepared us for. Humans do not fight the way anyone expects them to, and once you see it for yourself, you never see war the same way again." I asked him to continue, and he did, though his hands had not stopped shaking since the moment I sat down. The formation near the coastline held its position for exactly 11 hours before the first real skirmish began, and Vexthal remembered every minute of it as if it had happened the day before. The compact ships were never meant to be an assault force. They carried defensive systems, standard shielding, and a handful of small patrol craft meant for escort duty, nothing built for sustained combat against a species with no known space capability. Nobody expected a fight. That was the problem. Nobody had prepared for one. The first sign of trouble came from the ground, not the sky. A small group of human aircraft, old by any reasonable standard, flying low and fast beneath the range of the compact's primary sensors, approached the patrol craft stationed above the coastline. Compact protocol called for a warning broadcast, which was sent immediately, informing the aircraft that they were entering a restricted zone and should turn back. They did not turn back. "We assumed it was a mistake," Vexthal said. "We assumed they simply did not understand the warning, or that their instruments could not properly detect our presence. It never occurred to us that they understood everything and had already decided what they were going to do about it." The human aircraft released a barrage of ground-to-air projectiles, old technology by compact standards, nothing that should have been capable of piercing the shielding on a modern patrol craft. And yet, through a combination of overwhelming numbers, precise timing, and a targeting pattern that compact analysts later admitted looked less like luck and more like careful planning, one of the patrol craft took enough concentrated damage to lose primary power and drop from formation. It did not fall from the sky. The pilot managed to stabilize it and retreat, but the message was unmistakable, and it echoed through every ship in the fleet within minutes. They could hurt us. "I remember the reaction on the bridge," Vexthal said. "Confusion first, then something close to embarrassment. Then, slowly, something else. A kind of unease none of us had words for yet, because none of us had ever needed those words before." Director Aranis, still hoping to avoid a full escalation, ordered a controlled response, a show of force meant to end the confrontation quickly and with minimal casualties on either side. A small detachment of compact ground forces, equipped with standard non-lethal suppression tools designed for crowd control on newly integrated worlds, was deployed to secure the coastline and establish a clear boundary. It was, Vexthal admitted, the single worst decision of the entire campaign. The ground team, expecting to face a lightly organized local defense force, instead encountered something they had no framework for understanding. Human resistance fighters, using terrain the compact had never properly surveyed, employed tactics that seemed to shift and adapt in real time. They did not hold a line. They did not mass in the open, where compact firepower would have overwhelmed them instantly. Instead, they used the hills, the dense coastal forest, the narrow paths between old stone structures, appearing suddenly, striking with precision, and vanishing before any effective counter could be organized. It was not the weapons that frightened us, Vexthal said. Their weapons were, by our standards, almost laughably primitive. It was the pattern, the coordination, the complete absence of panic. Every species we had ever encountered, when faced with a clearly superior force, showed some sign of hesitation, some crack in their resolve. The humans showed none of that. They fought like the outcome was never in question, even when every visible piece of evidence said they should have already lost. The compact ground team was forced to withdraw within hours, having sustained losses that shocked commanders who had expected a swift, uneventful operation. 6 soldiers did not return. It was the first time in nearly 2 decades that a compact integration mission had suffered fatalities during what was supposed to be a routine security action. Word spread through the fleet almost instantly, and with it came the first real fracture in the confidence that had defined the mission from the beginning. I was assigned to a debrief that evening, Vexthal said. I remember a senior officer standing in front of a room full of stunned soldiers, trying to explain what had happened, and simply not having the words. He kept repeating the same phrase, "This should not have been possible. This should not have been possible," as if saying it enough times would make it true. Director Aranis requested reinforcements the next morning, still insisting, publicly at least, that the situation could be resolved through a combination of stronger presence and renewed diplomatic effort. Privately, according to records Vexthal later gained access to, Aranis had already begun drafting a report recommending full withdrawal, a report that was overruled by Compact High Command before it ever left his desk. They did not want to believe it either, Vexthal said. An entire species built around the assumption that overwhelming technological advantage always wins, faced for the first time with proof that it does not always, not against everyone. It is easier to send more ships than it is to admit your entire understanding of warfare might be wrong. More ships came. More soldiers came, and with them came a new phase of the conflict, one that Vexthal described as the point where the war stopped being a disagreement over a coastline and became something far larger. Human military forces, initially scattered and locally organized, began to coordinate on a scale the Compact had not anticipated. Reports came in from analysts trying to make sense of human broadcasts, radio and television signals never meant for compact ears, carrying messages that were, translated roughly, calls to defend their world from what the humans were now openly calling an invasion. That word struck something in me, Vexthal admitted. Invasion. We did not see ourselves that way. We saw ourselves as visitors, guides, offering a path toward a better future. It took me a long time to understand that intention does not matter nearly as much as we like to believe it does. What matters is what the people on the receiving end experience. And what they experienced, from the very first day, was exactly that. An invasion. The fighting spread beyond the coastline within 2 weeks, as human forces, still operating without any space capability of their own, began targeting compact ground installations across the region with a speed and coordination that suggested planning far more advanced than anyone had given them credit for. Supply lines were disrupted, communication relays were sabotaged. Compact soldiers, trained for peaceful integration rather than sustained combat, found themselves facing an enemy that refused every rule of engagement they had been taught to expect. Vexthal remembered one encounter in particular, a moment he said had stayed with him more clearly than almost anything else from that early period of the war. His unit had been sent to secure a small outpost near the disputed coastline, a routine assignment that turned into a night none of them ever forgot. As darkness fell, a group of human fighters approached the perimeter, moving with a discipline that unsettled even the most experienced compact soldiers present. What happened next was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was closer to a demonstration, a message delivered without a single unnecessary word. The human fighters disabled the outpost's defensive systems with tools improvised from salvaged compact technology recovered from the very patrol craft that had been damaged weeks earlier. They moved through the outpost with precision, neutralizing resistance without excessive force, and left behind a message, translated the next morning by a shaken linguist assigned to the unit. "We did not come to your world," the message read. "You came to ours. Leave, and this ends. Stay, and it will not." That was the first time I truly understood, Vexthal said, that we were not dealing with a primitive species stumbling through an unfamiliar situation. We were dealing with a species that understood exactly what was happening and had chosen, deliberately and without hesitation, to resist with everything they had. The translation of the human battle cry, the phrase Vexthal had mentioned earlier in our conversation, came from that same period, though he did not explain its full meaning until much later in our conversation. At the time, compact linguists had rendered it as a simple expression of defiance, a phrase shouted by human fighters during engagements that the automated translation systems interpreted as something close to, "We will not yield." It was close, Vexthal said, but it was not quite right. And by the time I learned the true meaning, months later, from a human prisoner who had no reason left to lie to me, I understood that even our best translators had been softening something that was never meant to be soft. He paused there, staring at that same spot on the wall again, and for a long moment I thought he might not continue at all. "The doctrine we had built our entire military structure around," he finally said, "was designed for wars against enemies who could be reasoned with, who understood the mathematics of loss and gain, who would surrender once the cost of resistance clearly outweighed the benefit. Every species we had ever fought, whether in formal conflict or minor territorial dispute, eventually reached a point where continuing to resist simply stopped making sense to them, and they stopped." He looked at me then, and his voice grew quieter, almost reverent, though there was fear woven through it as well. "Humans never reached that point, not once, not in the entire war. We kept waiting for the moment their resolve would break, the moment the losses would become too great, the moment they would finally understand that resistance was no longer rational. That moment never came. And the longer we waited for it, the more soldiers we lost trying to force it into existence. The fighting near the coastline escalated steadily over the following month, spreading to neighboring regions as human forces demonstrated a capacity for rapid coordination that compact analysts struggled to explain. Compact Command, still operating under the belief that a decisive display of force would eventually bring the conflict to an end, authorized a larger offensive, one intended to finally establish clear and unquestionable compact dominance over the contested territory. It was meant to end the war within days. Instead, Vexthal told me, it was the moment everyone in the fleet finally understood, with complete and terrible clarity, exactly what they had gotten themselves into. "I was there," he said. "I was part of that offensive. And what I saw in the days that followed changed everything I believed about strength, about fear, and about what a species is truly capable of when it decides that surrender is simply not an option it is willing to consider." He reached for his glass one final time, found it empty, and set it back down without refilling it. "If you want to understand the true horror of fighting humans," he said, "that offensive is where it truly begins." The offensive was named, with a kind of confidence that now made Vexthal wince to remember, the final resolution. Compact Command believed, with total sincerity, that a coordinated strike across every major human position near the coastline would end the conflict within a week. 3 fleets were committed. Ground forces numbering in the tens of thousands were deployed. Every available resource in the region was directed toward a single outcome, a swift and total demonstration of compact superiority that would leave humanity with no rational choice but surrender. "We believed in the mathematics of it completely," Vexthal said. "More ships, more soldiers, more advanced technology, applied all at once, against a species with no space capability and limited industrial infrastructure. On paper, it was not even a contest. It should have been over before it truly began. The first 3 days went exactly as planned. Compact forces secured key positions along the coastline with minimal resistance, and reports from the front described human forces retreating in what analysts characterized as disorganized withdrawal. For the first time since the conflict began, morale on the compact side began to recover. Vexthal remembered officers speaking openly about returning home, about the war finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. "We should have recognized it for what it was," he said. "Not a retreat, a trap." On the 4th day, everything changed. Vexthal's unit had been assigned to hold a supply corridor roughly 40 kilometers inland, a position considered secure enough that command had reduced its defensive garrison to free up soldiers for the advancing front line. It was, in hindsight, exactly the kind of overconfidence that had defined the entire offensive. Under cover of a coastal storm that compact sensors struggled to penetrate, human forces launched a coordinated strike against nearly a dozen supply corridors simultaneously, using terrain knowledge and tactical timing that suggested planning on a scale far beyond anything compact intelligence had accounted for. Vexthal's position was one of them. "I remember the storm most clearly," he said. "The way it made everything feel closed in, as if the sky itself had decided to help them. Our sensors were degraded. Our communications were unreliable. And somehow, they used every piece of that against us with a precision that felt less like improvisation and more like they had simply been waiting for the right conditions all along." The attack began without warning, human fighters emerging from concealed positions along the corridor, moving with a coordination that left little room for an organized, compact response. Vexthal described the following hours in fragments, memories that came to him not as a continuous narrative, but as isolated moments burned permanently into his mind. He remembered the sound of the storm mixing with the sound of the fighting, indistinguishable from one another. He remembered watching soldiers he had served alongside for years fall in positions that should have been secure. He remembered giving orders that no longer made sense the moment they left his mouth, because the situation was changing faster than any command structure could adapt to. And he remembered, more than anything else, the moment his own position was overrun. "I was separated from my unit within the first hour," he said. "I do not remember exactly how. One moment I was directing a defensive line, and the next I was alone, wounded, in unfamiliar terrain, with no communication and no clear sense of which direction led back to safety." He found shelter in a small structure, once a storage building for local farming equipment, and remained there through the worst of the storm, listening to distant sounds of fighting that gradually grew quieter, though he could not tell whether that meant the battle was ending or simply moving elsewhere. It was there, hours later, that he encountered the human who would change the entire course of his understanding of the war. His name was Daniel, Vexthal said, and for the first time in our conversation, something in his voice softened, just slightly, though the underlying tension never fully disappeared. "I did not know that at the time. I only knew that the door to the structure I was hiding in opened, and a human soldier stepped inside, weapon raised, clearly expecting to find exactly what he found." Vexthal described the moment with a clarity that suggested he had relived it countless times in the years since. He was wounded, unarmed, his equipment damaged beyond use during the earlier fighting. He had no way to defend himself, no way to escape, and by every rule of engagement he understood, he expected the encounter to end there. It did not. "He looked at me for a long time," Vexthal said. "Longer than made sense, given the circumstances. I remember thinking he was deciding how to end it. I remember, strangely, feeling no fear in that moment, only a kind of exhausted acceptance. And then he lowered his weapon." Daniel, as Vexthal later learned, said nothing at first. He simply moved closer, examined Vexthal's injuries with a directness that suggested some degree of medical training, and began treating the wounds using supplies from his own equipment, supplies that, by any reasonable measure, he could not afford to spare. I did not understand it, Vexthal admitted. I still do not fully understand it, even now. I was the enemy. I represented everything his people were fighting against. He had every justification, by any standard either of our species would recognize, to end the encounter in the way soldiers are trained to end such encounters. Instead, he chose not to. They remained together in that small structure for nearly 2 days, unable to communicate in any meaningful way beyond gestures and the basic translation functions still operating on Vexthal's damaged equipment. Daniel shared what supplies he had. He did not attempt to take Vexthal prisoner, nor did he attempt to leave him behind. He simply stayed, tending to injuries that were not his responsibility to tend, until the storm passed and the sounds of fighting in the distance finally fell silent. I asked him, through the translator, why. Vexthal said. I remember the response taking a long time to process, because the translator struggled with the phrasing. When it finally rendered the words, they were simple. He said, "You were not fighting when I found you. I do not fight people who are not fighting." Vexthal stopped speaking for a long moment, and I did not push him to continue. When he finally did, his voice had changed, quieter, more deliberate. That single sentence undid more of my understanding about this species than every battle that came before it, he said. We had spent months believing humans fought without limits, without restraint, without any of the structures we assumed a civilized species required to prevent warfare from becoming something monstrous. And here was a soldier, in the middle of the most desperate fighting either of us had experienced, choosing restraint in a moment when restraint offered him nothing but risk. When compact search teams eventually located Vexthal, Daniel had already left, slipping away sometime before dawn without explanation, leaving behind enough supplies to ensure Vexthal would survive until help arrived. Vexthal never saw him again, though he told me he had spent years afterward trying, through official channels and unofficial ones, to learn what had become of him. I never found out, he said. I do not know if he survived the war. I do not know if he ever thought about that encounter again, the way I have thought about it every day since. I only know that he chose to see me as something other than an enemy, in a moment when every reasonable justification existed for him to do otherwise. When Vexthal reported the encounter to Compact Command upon his return, the reaction was not what he expected. They did not believe me, he said. Not fully. There was an assumption, unspoken but clear, that I was misremembering the encounter, that trauma and injury had distorted my perception of what actually happened. It was easier for them to believe that than to reconcile it with everything else we had learned about human resistance during the offensive. The final resolution, despite its ambitious name, ended not in compact victory, but in a costly, chaotic withdrawal that Compact Command struggled to characterize honestly in official reports. Losses across the coordinated offensive were staggering, far beyond anything the Compact had anticipated, and for the first time since the conflict began, senior leadership began openly questioning whether victory, in the traditional sense, was achievable at all. That was when the doctrine truly began to fail, Vexthal said. Every model we used to predict enemy behavior assumed a rational actor, a species that would eventually calculate the cost of continued resistance and choose to stop. Humans broke that model completely. They did not fight less as losses increased. They fought harder. Every setback seemed only to strengthen their resolve rather than weaken it, as though their capacity for resistance was not diminished by loss, but somehow fed by it. Vexthal described the following months as a period of growing dread among compact forces, a slow, creeping realization that the war they had entered, expecting a swift and orderly conclusion, had become something far more dangerous and far less predictable than anything in compact military history. Human tactics continued to evolve at a pace that unsettled even the most experienced compact strategists. What began as localized guerrilla resistance grew into increasingly coordinated operations, as human forces studied captured compact technology and adapted their own methods in response. Compact Command noted with growing alarm that human forces seemed to learn faster with each engagement, adjusting not only their tactics but their equipment, salvaging and reverse engineering compact technology at a rate that defied every projection compact intelligence had made about human industrial capability. "We began to fear something we had never truly feared before," Vexthal said. "Not their weapons, not their tactics. We began to fear their capacity to learn. Every encounter taught them something new, and they applied that knowledge faster than we could adjust our own strategies to compensate." There was, Vexthal explained, a growing psychological toll among compact soldiers during this period, one that military leadership struggled to address through conventional means. Soldiers who had fought in dozens of prior integration conflicts, veterans with decades of experience against a wide range of species, began reporting a form of exhaustion unlike anything they had previously encountered. Not merely physical fatigue, but a deeper, more unsettling sense that the enemy they faced did not behave according to any framework they understood. "There is a particular kind of unease," Vexthal said, "that comes from fighting an opponent who does not respond the way fear is supposed to make them respond. We are used to enemies who, when faced with overwhelming loss, eventually break. Humans did not break. They adapted. They endured. And in some strange, terrible way, the harder we pushed, the more determined they seemed to become." He described one specific incident that he said had become something of a quiet legend among compact veterans of the campaign, a story passed between soldiers not through official channels, but through the kind of informal communication that spreads among people who have shared something no official report could ever properly capture. A compact patrol, operating near a region that had already seen months of fighting, encountered a small group of human civilians attempting to relocate away from the conflict zone. Standard protocol called for the patrol to secure the area and process the civilians according to established procedure. Instead, the patrol found itself unexpectedly protected, shielded from an approaching human military strike by the very civilians they had been sent to secure. Ordinary people who, upon realizing what was about to happen, chose to place themselves between the compact soldiers and the incoming danger rather than allow the strike to proceed unopposed. "Nobody ordered them to do that," Vexthal said. "There was no tactical advantage in it for them. If anything, it complicated their own military's plans considerably. And yet they did it anyway, because in their understanding of the world, allowing harm to come to people who were not actively fighting, even people who represented the very forces invading their world, was something they were simply unwilling to permit." It was moments like these, scattered throughout the war, that Vexthal said gradually reshaped compact understanding of humanity, not through official intelligence reports, but through the slow accumulation of individual encounters, each one chipping away at the simplified narrative Compact Command had constructed at the beginning of the conflict. "We had told ourselves a story," Vexthal said, "a story about a primitive species, fighting out of fear and desperation, incapable of the kind of complex moral reasoning that guided our own military conduct. That story fell apart, piece by piece, encounter by encounter, until none of us could pretend to believe it any longer." By the end of what compact historians would later call the Doctrine Collapse period, senior leadership had begun quietly circulating a very different set of assumptions among field commanders, assumptions that acknowledged, for the first time, that the war against humanity could not be won through the methods that had succeeded against every other species the compact had ever encountered. That realization, Vexthal said, was the true beginning of the horror, not the fighting itself, though there was more than enough of that to fill a lifetime of nightmares. The horror was understanding that we were facing something our entire military philosophy had no answer for, and that every day the war continued, we were learning more about exactly how unprepared we truly were. He fell silent for a long moment, staring once more at that same spot on the wall, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. And that, he said, was only the beginning of what humanity was capable of, once they truly understood what they were fighting for. The months following the failed offensive marked what Vexthal described as the true turning point of the war, the period when the conflict stopped resembling anything the Compact had prepared for and became something entirely new, not just for the soldiers fighting it, but for the very structure of Compact military strategy itself. Command finally accepted what those of us on the ground had understood for some time, Vexthal said. This was no longer a containment action. This was a war, in every sense of the word, against an opponent whose capabilities were growing faster than anyone had believed possible. Human industrial adaptation, Vexthal explained, became the defining feature of this period of the conflict. Compact intelligence had initially assessed human manufacturing capability as decades behind what would be required to produce weapons capable of matching Compact technology. That assessment collapsed within a matter of months, as human engineers, working from salvaged and captured Compact equipment, began producing functional adaptations of Compact systems at a pace that defied every projection. We underestimated everything about them, Vexthal admitted. Their ability to learn, their ability to build. Most of all, we underestimated their willingness to commit every available resource toward a single purpose. Entire human economies reorganized around the war effort within a remarkably short period, something Compact analysts described, with a mixture of professional admiration and genuine unease, as total mobilization. Factories that had once produced civilian goods began producing weapons and equipment adapted from captured Compact technology. Human scientists, working with a fraction of the resources available to Compact research divisions, made rapid advances in fields that Compact intelligence had assumed would take generations for a species at humanity's technological starting point to master. There is a particular kind of horror, Vexthal said, in watching an enemy improve faster than you can counter them. We had built our entire military culture around technological superiority as the ultimate guarantee of victory. Watching that gap close, week by week, engagement by engagement, was unlike anything any of us had experienced in our careers. It was during this period that a human military commander emerged, whose name became known throughout the Compact fleet, spoken with a mixture of professional respect and something closer to genuine unease. Vexthal referred to her simply as Commander Ellen Ashworth, a name that, by his account, had become almost mythological among Compact soldiers stationed near the conflict zone. I never met her directly, Vexthal said. Few Compact soldiers who encountered her forces directly survived to describe the experience in detail. What we knew of her came from intercepted communications, from captured documents, and from the accounts of soldiers who fought against units under her command and lived to describe what they witnessed. Commander Ashworth, according to the fragments of information the Compact managed to gather, had built a reputation for tactics that combined careful, methodical planning with a willingness to take risks that Compact strategists found almost incomprehensible. She was credited with several of the most devastating engagements of the entire war, operations that consistently inflicted losses on Compact forces far beyond what conventional military analysis would have predicted possible given the resources available to her. What made her different, Vexthal said, was not simply her tactical skill, though that alone would have made her formidable. It was the way she seemed to understand exactly how we thought, exactly what assumptions our command structure relied upon, and she exploited those assumptions with a precision that felt, at times, almost personal. Vexthal described one engagement in particular, relayed to him years later by a fellow officer who had survived it, that had become something of a defining moment in how Compact forces understood the nature of the enemy they faced. A Compact detachment, believing they had identified and surrounded a small human resistance unit in a remote mountain region, prepared for what should have been a straightforward engagement against a numerically inferior force. Instead, They discovered too late that the unit they had located was a deliberate decoy, positioned precisely to draw compact forces into a location where the surrounding terrain that Commander Ashworth's forces had spent weeks quietly preparing, turned the engagement into a decisive defeat for the compact detachment. It was not luck, Vexthal said. It was patience, a willingness to sacrifice an apparent advantage in the short term in exchange for a devastating result later. That kind of thinking, the willingness to accept short-term losses for long-term strategic gain, was something our own doctrine actively discouraged. We valued immediate results. Humans, or at least commanders like her, seemed to value the long game far more than we ever had. The psychological impact of facing commanders like Ashworth, Vexthal explained, extended far beyond the immediate tactical losses. Compact soldiers began to develop a deep and pervasive wariness that affected morale across the entire fleet, a growing sense that no engagement, however favorable it appeared on paper, could be trusted to unfold as expected. That uncertainty, Vexthal said, was its own kind of weapon. We began second-guessing every advantage we thought we had, wondering if it was real or if it was another trap being carefully constructed. That kind of doubt spreads through a military force like a sickness. It does not need to defeat you directly, it simply needs to make you afraid of your own judgment. It was during this period, roughly a year into the conflict, that Vexthal said the true nature of what made humanity such a formidable enemy finally became clear to him, a realization that had less to do with tactics or technology and more to do with something far more fundamental. I had a conversation with an older officer during this time, Vexthal said, a woman who had served in nearly every major compact conflict of the previous 3 decades. I asked her what she believed was truly different about this war, compared to everything she had experienced before. Her answer stayed with me for the rest of my life. The officer, according to Vexthal, had explained that in every previous conflict the compact had engaged in, the opposing species had ultimately fought for reasons the compact could understand and, eventually, negotiate around. Territory, resources, political advantage, even deeply held cultural beliefs, while difficult to reconcile, still operated within a framework of rational calculation that allowed for eventual compromise once the costs of continued conflict became clear. Humans were different, Vexthal said, repeating the officer's words as though he had memorized them precisely. They did not fight as though they were calculating costs and benefits. They fought as though giving up was simply not a concept their species had ever fully developed. Not recklessness, not fanaticism, not in the way we understood that word, something closer to an absolute, unshakable belief that stopping was never truly an option, regardless of what continuing might cost them. This, Vexthal explained, was the truth at the heart of everything that made the war against humanity so uniquely devastating, a truth that took the compact far too long to fully understand and accept. We kept waiting for the moment they would break, he said. We built our entire strategy around the assumption that such a moment must eventually come, because in every other conflict we had ever fought, it always had. We never understood, until it was far too late, that we were not fighting a species that calculated when resistance stopped being worthwhile. We were fighting a species that had built its entire identity, generation after generation, around the belief that resistance was worthwhile, regardless of the cost, so long as something worth protecting still remained. He paused, and for the first time in our conversation, he looked directly at me rather than at that distant point on the wall, and I felt, for a brief moment, the full weight of everything he had witnessed. That is the horrifying truth, he said quietly. It was never really about their weapons, or their technology, or even their tactics, remarkable as all of those things eventually became. It was that they fought every single engagement as though it were personal, as though every loss meant something beyond the immediate tactical consequence, and as though every fallen soldier represented not a statistic to be calculated into future strategy, but a reason to fight harder rather than a reason to stop. By this point in the war, Vexthal explained, Compact Command had begun quietly acknowledging, in reports that never reached public record, that outright military victory over humanity, in the traditional sense the Compact understood victory, might not be achievable within any reasonable time frame or cost. "We could win individual battles," he said. "We proved that many times over the course of the war, but winning battles was never the same as winning the war, and every strategist who studied the conflict eventually reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. A species willing to absorb any cost, indefinitely, in defense of what they valued, could not be defeated through the methods that had worked against every other species the Compact had ever encountered." It was this realization, slowly forming across Compact leadership throughout that difficult year, that eventually set the stage for what would become the final chapter of the conflict. A chapter that Vexthal said was, in its own way, even more difficult for him to discuss than everything that had come before it. "Understanding that you cannot win a war through force alone is one thing," he said. "Finding a way to end that war without simply admitting total defeat is something else entirely. And what happened next taught me more about humanity and about the true cost of underestimating another species than anything I had experienced up to that point." He rose from his seat then, moved to the window of the small room where we sat, and looked out at the sky for a long moment before speaking again. "If you want to understand how the war truly ended," he said, "and why the peace that followed was never really a victory for anyone, you need to hear what happened during the final negotiations. Because that, more than any battle, is where I finally understood exactly what we had been fighting all along." The final year of the war, Vexthal told me, was unlike anything that had come before it, not because the fighting grew more intense, though in certain regions it certainly did, but because both sides had finally arrived at an understanding that neither wanted to admit openly. Compact Command still believed, on some level, that victory remained possible, he said, but the reports coming from every front told a different story. Human forces were no longer simply resisting, they were beginning to push back into territory the Compact had held for months. Their weapons had closed the technological gap to a degree nobody had believed possible when the war began, and their willingness to continue fighting showed no sign of diminishing, regardless of the losses on either side. It was during this period that Vexthal was reassigned to a role he had never expected, serving as a liaison officer attached to a small diplomatic team tasked with exploring the possibility of a negotiated resolution to the conflict. His experience surviving behind enemy lines, along with his growing, if reluctant, understanding of human behavior, made him one of the few Compact officers whose insight commanders were willing to seriously consider. "I did not want the assignment," he admitted. "By that point, I had seen enough of the war to last several lifetimes, but I also understood, better than most, that continuing to fight without truly understanding the enemy would only lead to more losses, on both sides, with no clearer resolution in sight." The negotiations, when they finally began, were unlike any diplomatic process the Compact had previously engaged in. Human representatives, drawn from a coalition of nations that had unified specifically to coordinate the war effort, approached the discussions not as a defeated party seeking mercy, but as an equal party negotiating terms. "That alone told us everything we needed to know," Vexthal said. "In every previous integration conflict, even the difficult ones, there eventually came a point where the opposing species approached negotiations from a position of clear submission, however reluctant. Humans never did that. They negotiated as though they still had every option available to them, because, in truth, they did." Vexthal described the early negotiation sessions as tense, formal, and marked by a kind of guarded respect that surprised him given everything that had come before. Human representatives did not gloat over Compact losses, nor did they demand humiliating concessions. They simply stated, with a calm clarity that Vexthal found almost unsettling, exactly what they required to consider the conflict resolved. Their primary demand was simple, he said: complete withdrawal from their territory and formal recognition of their sovereignty as an independent species, free to determine their own path forward without compact oversight. No punitive measures beyond that. No demands for reparations beyond the return of what had been taken. It was, in its own way, remarkably restrained, given everything they could have justified asking for. Compact leadership, still struggling to reconcile the reality of the war with the confident assumptions that had defined its beginning, debated the terms for weeks. Some officials argued for continued resistance, believing that accepting such terms would represent an unacceptable admission of compact weakness before the wider galactic community. Others, including several senior military commanders who had witnessed the full extent of the conflict firsthand, argued that continuing the war would only produce further losses without any realistic prospect of the outcome changing. "I was asked to give testimony during those internal debates," Vexthal said. "I remember standing before a room of officials who had never set foot on a human battlefield, trying to explain something that felt almost impossible to convey through words alone. I told them the truth, as plainly as I could manage. I told them that humanity would not stop fighting, not because they did not understand the cost, but because stopping was simply not something their species had ever learned how to do, so long as something worth defending remained." It was during one of these sessions that Vexthal finally learned the true meaning of the human battle cry that had haunted him since the earliest days of the conflict. The phrase, compact translators had originally rendered as a simple expression of defiance. A human diplomat, a woman named Grace Whitfield, who had served as a senior translator throughout the negotiation process, explained the phrase to him directly, during a private conversation that took place outside the formal proceedings. "She told me the phrase did not simply mean, 'we will not yield,'" Vexthal said. "It carried a deeper meaning, one that our automated translation systems had never fully captured. The closest equivalent she could offer was something closer to, 'we remain, no matter what comes.' Not a statement of resistance against an enemy, but a statement of identity. A declaration that no matter what was taken from them, no matter what was lost, they would continue to exist, continue to endure, continue to be who they were." Vexthal said that single explanation reshaped his entire understanding of the war, retroactively, more than any single battle or encounter that had come before it. "We had spent the entire conflict trying to break their will to fight," he said, without ever understanding that fighting, for them, was never separate from simply existing. To ask them to stop resisting was, in their understanding, to ask them to stop being who they were. That is not a request any species will ever agree to, regardless of the cost involved in refusing. The negotiations concluded, after nearly 4 months of difficult and often contentious discussion, with an agreement that satisfied neither side completely, but that both sides, exhausted by the cost of continued conflict, were ultimately willing to accept. Compact forces withdrew fully from human territory. Formal recognition of human sovereignty was granted, along with an agreement establishing careful, mutually respectful terms for any future contact between the two civilizations. "It was not a compact victory," Vexthal said. "Everyone involved understood that, even if official records were later written to obscure the reality of what had actually happened. It was not truly a human victory either, not in the traditional sense, given everything they had lost throughout the course of the conflict. It was simply an ending, the kind that comes when both sides finally accept that continuing further will only produce more loss, with no clearer resolution ever likely to emerge." Vexthal remained in the region for several months following the formal end of the conflict, assisting with the final stages of compact withdrawal, and it was during this period that he had one final encounter that he said had stayed with him more than almost anything else from the entire war. While overseeing the transfer of a small compact outpost back to human authority, he encountered a young human soldier assigned to receive the facility, a soldier who, upon learning that Vexthal had served throughout the entire conflict, asked him a question that Vexthal said he had never fully been able to answer. "He asked me why we came," Vexthal said, not aggressively, not with any particular anger. He seemed genuinely curious. I tried to explain the Compact's belief in guided integration, the sincere conviction that we had approached his people with good intentions, hoping to offer them a path toward a better future among the wider galactic community. He listened to all of it, and then he simply said, "We were already building our future, you just could not see it yet." Vexthal told me that response had remained with him for every year since, a quiet, unresolved discomfort that no amount of time had ever fully eased. "That, I think, is the deepest truth of everything that happened," he said. "We saw a species we believed needed guidance, needed help finding its way toward the kind of civilization we considered advanced and worthwhile. What we failed to understand was that they were never lost to begin with. They were simply different, moving toward their own future in their own way, and our arrival, however well-intentioned, was never anything but an unwanted interruption to a path they had already chosen for themselves." When Vexthal finally returned home after the war's end, he said he carried with him a perspective that few of his fellow Compact citizens, safe and distant from the actual fighting, could ever fully understand. People wanted stories of victory, he said. Or, failing that, stories of a noble defeat against an overwhelming enemy. What I had to offer them was neither. I had a story about a species we underestimated so completely, and for so long, that by the time we understood our mistake, the cost of that misunderstanding had already become permanent. There is no glory in that kind of story. There is only the responsibility to make sure it is remembered accurately, so that whoever encounters humanity next understands, before the first shot is ever fired, exactly what they are truly facing. He looked at me then, and for the first time since our conversation began, something in his expression softened into what I can only describe as a kind of weary hope. "That is why I agreed to speak with you," he said. "Not because I enjoy remembering any of this. I do not. I speak because somewhere out there, another species is going to encounter humanity for the first time, the way we did, and I would rather they understand the truth before that meeting happens than learn it the way we were forced to, one devastating lesson at a time." I asked him, finally, what he believed the true lesson of the war truly was, if he had to summarize it in a single thought. He considered the question for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the hesitation that had marked the beginning of our conversation, only a quiet, hard-earned certainty. "Humans do not fight wars the way other species fight wars," he said. "They do not calculate whether resistance remains worthwhile. They do not measure the cost of continuing against the benefit of stopping. They fight because stopping was never truly an option their species learned how to accept, not while something worth protecting still remained. That is not fanaticism. It is not recklessness. It is simply who they are, woven into the very core of what it means to be human. And if you ever find yourself standing against them, do not make the mistake we made. Do not assume that losing will ever be enough to make them stop." He rose from his seat, signaling that our conversation had reached its natural end, and walked me to the door of the small room where we had spent the past several hours. Before I left, he offered one final thought, delivered quietly, almost to himself. "We came looking for a species to guide," he said. "What we found instead was a species that would rather burn everything to the ground than be told who they were meant to become. I hope, wherever you go next, you remember that lesson better than we did." The door closed behind me, and I stood alone in the corridor for a long moment, turning his words over in my mind, understanding, perhaps for the first time, why no one else had ever managed to get him to speak this openly about the war. Some truths, once learned, are simply too heavy to set down again.